Welcome, everyone. Let's begin by bowing in. And welcome to the class, The Buddhist Path of Awakening, which is based on the text, The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma by Chögyam Trungpa. As I say every week, but for the benefit of people who may not have been here before, this text is in three parts, relating to the three stages of the Tibetan Buddhist path. The first volume covers the Hinayana, or lesser or foundational vehicle. The second volume, which we are on now, covers the Mahayana, or greater vehicle. And the third volume covers the Vajrayana, or the adamantine, or indestructible vehicle. This whole text is based on talks given by Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche over a period of some 15 years. Well, actually longer than that, but there were a couple of years that were skipped, several. And in each of those years, he took anywhere from 150 to 250 students away for 3 months of retreat. And during that time, they practiced a lot, and they also studied a lot. And those retreats were divided into these three sections: Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. Every night during the study sections of those retreats, Trungpa Rinpoche lectured, and those lectures have been transcribed and digested into these three volumes, digested and edited by Judith Leaf. So we are now on volume 2, in the Mahayana, and we're on chapter 10, which is on the subject of the spiritual friend. The spiritual friend is the title or the designation that indicates the teacher at the Mahayana stage of the path. At the Hinayana stage of the path, it really has no name like that, just teacher. But the Hinayana teacher has a different quality. The Hinayana teacher has the quality of being a preceptor, an instructor in doctrine and in technique, and a guide, an authority figure. At the Hinayana stage of the path, the teacher's function is to teach the student the basics of Buddhist doctrine and the practices that go along with that at that stage. The practices being shamatha, mindfulness practice, and vipassana. The student at this stage of the path achieves a number of things. The main being, 1, they cease to do harm to others. They're cleaning up their act. 2, they understand the 1.5-fold egolessness, which means they understand that the I, what we call an I, is just a fiction, doesn't actually exist, and is the cause of a lot of suffering. And then they partially understand that not only does I not exist, but neither does other. When you have I, you have other. And when you have other, you have I. And at the Hinayana stage of the path, they discover what's called the 1.5-fold egolessness, meaning they fully understand actually still to some degree, the egolessness of I, and only halfway understand the egolessness of other. Further, because they are practicing mindfulness and awareness, shamatha and vipassana practice, the practitioner at this stage of the path achieves a freedom from suffering because they have given up, or are beginning to give up, the dreams that inhabit one's mind. And those dreams are always fraught with suffering, fraught with hope and fear, wishing things were otherwise, tension, the three poisons, aggression, passion, and stupidity. These dreams are riddled with all of that. And in beginning to fully understand and practice mindfulness practice especially, and awareness, the practitioner, the student practitioner, is giving up those painful thoughts and is coming back into simple awareness of this present moment, and so achieves a freedom from suffering. This brings the student to the Mahayana stage of the path. At this point, they have to go further. And at the Mahayana stage of the path, there are many things that develop. One of them is that the relationship with the teacher changes. And the teacher at this stage of the path is called a spiritual friend, a Kalyana Mitra in Sanskrit. Mitra means friend, and Kalyana has to do with spirituality. In Tibetan, it's Gewe Shenyen. Shenyen means friend, very close friend or companion. And Gewe means virtuous, has to do with virtuous. Ge is the word for virtue, and wei is a particle that indicates that it modifies what comes after, turns it into an adjective. So it's the virtuous. Ge by itself would be virtue. Gewe means virtuous friend. Very virtuous and very close friend or companion. And this is the subject of the talk tonight. The Kalyana Mitra, the Gewe Shenyan, the spiritual friend. And what our relationship is with that, and what it does to further our path, that relationship. So he starts out by saying that once we have realized the need to give up aggression, passion, stupidity, these are the three poisons which constellate around belief in an I. As long as one believes in an I, then everything, the other, is constantly being judged in one of three ways. It's either for us, against us, or neutral, indifferent. If it's for us, we want to pull it towards us because we feel that it will augment I, me. And that's passion. If we feel that it's dangerous, that it threatens us, we want to push it away. And that's aggression. And if we feel that it's just neutral, then we're indifferent to it. And that's called stupidity. And so we begin to realize that we need to give up these poisons. They're really the essence of pain, the essence of unhappiness and suffering. They keep us separated from our world and in a constant state of wishing things were otherwise, which is the very nature, fundamental foundation of suffering. And so we begin to give birth to gentleness toward ourselves, which is Maitri. This happens in meditation. When we begin to stop chastising ourselves for being a poor meditator and simply see it and let it go. See it as it is. See all our thoughts, all our emotions as they arise, simply as they are, and stop beating ourselves up for it. Stop saying, oh, I've just been dreaming for the last 30 minutes. I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible meditator. We'll never get anywhere. We give that up. And in doing that, we're beginning to develop a kind of kindness for ourselves. That kindness furthers our awareness because we're not engaged in that next thought of aggression, which is aggression toward ourselves. It's the beginning of gentleness, kindness, and compassion, and it starts with oneself. to be kind to oneself, to allow oneself to see oneself clearly and allow that to be as it is, without self-criticism, self-judgment. And this then begins to give birth to kindness to others, which is called karuna in Sanskrit, nyingje in Tibetan, which means noble heart. Because as we begin to become kind to ourselves, we can then extend that out. It happens automatically, really, to the people that we encounter in our lives. That same kindness, that same gentleness. And we can awaken, this was the subject of the last chapter, our enlightened genes, they're called. This is our fundamental nature of enlightenment. And these enlightened genes are maitri, kindness to oneself, karuna, kindness to others, gawa in Tibetan, well, mudita in Sanskrit, which means joy, and upeksha, which means equanimity. This was the subject of last week's talk. Awakening enlightened genes, these 4 qualities. As we begin to develop kindness to ourselves, we can then extend it out to others. It's natural to do that, which is compassion, the act of compassion for others. And this begins to make us very happy. We begin to relax into this kind of kindness and gentleness, which is the mudita, the joy that we can discover. And ultimately, we become very calm, what's the word? Equanimous? There must be an adjective there for equanimity.
Equanimous.
Equanimous, thank you. Thank you, whoever that was.
Ed.
Sounded like you, Ed. Equanimous, which means that we're resting in this awareness, calmly, clearly. Now that we have this, and we know that we have begun to develop all this, the teacher changes and becomes a very different kind of person, a spiritual friend. This is a more powerful manifestation of the teacher. The teacher isn't at this point just an instructor or an example, as they are at the Hinayana stage of the path, but they actually are interacting with us, with our minds, our behavior. And they become very much a spiritual friend who shows us how to help ourselves and how to help others, although the actual helping has to be done by each one of us. The spiritual friend shows you and tells you how bad samsara is and how fortunate you are to tread the path. And the spiritual friend is like, really, you've got all the seeds now. You've begun to develop shamatha and vipassana. You've begun to discover that you can meditate, and by meditating you can achieve a degree of equanimity, as well as maitri, compassion, and even some joy. You've begun to discover all this, and these are the seeds. But you don't quite know what to do with them yet. Really what you need to do with them, these seeds, is plant them. Plant them in the field of Bodhi, in the field of your mind, and begin to develop them. And so the spiritual friend at this point is like an experienced farmer who is telling you how to plant the seeds that you have developed at the Hinayana stage of the path, all of this potentiality, and bring it much further along to cultivate the crop. And the crop is Bodhi, awakenness. He says, the spiritual friend also brings trouble for you, and your role is to have to deal with it. He says the teacher-student relationship is a delightful dance because the teacher is poking at your egotism. This is a much more intimate relationship than it was at the Hinayana stage of the path. The teacher is now beginning to really mind your business, get into your mind. Although it takes two to tango, the teacher has to be capable and interested and see it as appropriate for you, and you have to be open to it, to be open to the relationship with the teacher, which is a much more intimate and friendship-based relationship than the one at the Hinayana, beginning stage of the path. He says, in the Mahayana, there is a greater need for leadership than in the Hinayana stage. Leadership by example. You need personal communication with someone who is actually practicing the Bodhisattva path, someone who has successfully done it, or is at least on it, who has actually attained some level of Buddhahood. That sounds pretty glorious, but it's not. Although such a person does not have to be a completely realized Buddha, but they have achieved some level of understanding beyond neurotic ego mind. First, you feel welcomed by your spiritual friend, and a connection is established, one of friendship. Then you need to look at what needs to be solved, what dropped, and what cultivated. In fact, he says, one of the functions of the spiritual friend is to interrupt your life, to steer you away from harmful behaviors and save your life. That is what real friends do. Only fake friends indulge you. So the relationship with the spiritual friend is not just a bed of roses. The spiritual friend can give you difficulty because what they want to do is to interrupt, to short circuit your neuroticism, your neurotic behavior, which is habitual, which you take for granted. Each one of us does. And the spiritual friend does not at all. This can be very difficult. It can be very painful. It depends completely on each individual. He says that this relationship can feel to be very heavy, but it is not something heavy coming at you. It is your own fixation being revealed. Each one of us, to one degree or another, strong, medium, weak, has fixations that we have carried over from long time ago. They are habitual. They are stored in our alaya. The alaya is where you store, the alaya vijnana is the storehouse consciousness, where you store things that you have learned in the past, bad behaviors. And they come present, they come into action when they are triggered by events in the world. For instance, you may have been taught by usually a parent that when you don't like something, it's appropriate to be angry. And so when something comes up that seems to be challenging, threatening, you react with anger and aggression. It's a habitual, sort of knee-jerk response that we have learned over time. I'm just making one up. There's so many. We all have them. The spiritual friend sees them. And in one way or another, he or she brings them to our awareness, makes us deal with them in ways that are sane. And that can be very painful. Say you have an ambition. Say you've been taught that you need to be, a big deal in some way. And so you've spent your life trying to be a big deal. And the spiritual friend, they put you in a situation where you're not a big deal. And that can be very painful. All kinds of things. The spiritual friends are very earthy and ordinary, he says, and at the same time, they're very practical and powerful. They may tell you to change your behaviors, to cut out things, to add other things, because what they're interested in doing is freeing you from these habitual patterns, which are so limiting, which enslave us to pursuing some dreamed of better way to be, and have nothing to do with discovering the freedom, compassion, joy, and equanimity of this present moment. He says here, and this is almost an aside, that the spiritual friend is not a missionary selling the Buddhist path. That's the last thing that they want to do. This is a matter of real self-discovery, not a matter of selling some panacea, some belief system. It has nothing to do with it. And there's no secrecy. That's very embarrassing. We're stripped bare with the spiritual friend to the extent that we allow it to happen. Each one of us. It's an opportunity and a challenge to be open with the spiritual friend. To be open doesn't mean you tear open your shirt and like you reveal your chest. It means that you respond appropriately to the spiritual friend in the moment. And that appropriateness is without reservation, without self-protection, without ego-aggrandizement, without agenda. It's appropriate and open and human and shows one's heart and courage and kindness and all of that. He says the spiritual friend is the example of how we can give birth to absolute and relative bodhicitta, which is the subject of next week's amazing chapter. They show us the way. The first step we take is to develop kindness to ourselves. And it takes this kind of open communication. Trungpa Rinpoche always said that the very essence of the relationship with a teacher, what you want in a teacher, is friendship and open communication. And again, this is not a matter of being confessional, like of showing yourself what you're embarrassed about. It's a matter of being utterly open and responsive in the moment, appropriately so. Leave it up to the spiritual friend to make that deep. You don't have to. So then he talks about the attitudes that we can have toward a spiritual friend. The spiritual friend is a guide or a scout who leads you on the path. A spiritual friend is an escort through dangers and obstacles, protects you. And the spiritual friend is a good ferryman who crosses the river with and for you, rows you across in the boat. He says the river might be wide or turbulent, and the spiritual friend, the ferryman, is willing to share the danger and even sacrifice their life for your benefit. So learning to relate to a spiritual friend is learning how to be genuine. We're all paranoid about that in varying degrees, each one of us, some slightly, some more. The reverse, the opposite of being genuine is self-protection. We wear a mask. And really, that's what the spiritual friend has no need for. The spiritual friend will be utterly bored, uncommunicative, not there for each one of our masks. They could care less. They want to see the real person, the person's heart and mind. The spiritual friend works with you in terms of your own genuineness and your own capability to open and won't miss anything. The spiritual friend works with you inch by inch. He says, we have to work to overcome our basic habitual tendencies that have been developing for a long time, from way back before we entered the path. They are obstacles to realizing enlightenment, what we use to hide ourselves, to cheat ourselves, and short-circuit our enlightenment. And they're habitual. They have been learned, and we have practiced them over and over again out of fear. They are fear-based. And he says the problem with habitual patterns is timeless. It's always there, been taking place. It goes way back, before this birth, if you believe in rebirths. It includes excuses for not practicing. We're too busy. We need to work on whatever the big project is that people are relying on us for, and so we're not going to practice. We don't have time. Don't have time to practice enough. Too busy with other important things. Oh, I wanted to read a paragraph that I thought was so good about this. He says, the habitual tendency of short-circuiting your discipline is seemingly done for your own benefit, seemingly. But strangely, it seems that you want to hurt yourself, which is quite shocking. You prefer to remain invalid, and you don't want to be cured. If you look at it from the enlightened point of view, it is utterly shocking. You prefer to be like an Egyptian mummy with bandages all over your body. You prefer to sleep on like that. You don't want to completely recover from your wounds and be ready and willing to work. Instead, you want to go back to your bandages. Isn't that strange? Many of us tend to do that. It is quite shocking and maybe quite natural. Sometimes it is surprising, and sometimes it is obvious. It is shocking when somebody else does it, and it is obvious when you do it. Beyond that, when you realize what you have been doing, you become willing to be a truly genuine person. You are genuinely willing to listen to the Dharma. You come in on your own, right, with your own neuroses and your own problems. Then there are the four types of students. This is an old Buddhist trope. The one who is most desirable to be is like an upright container, like a cup that's turned up and is solid, firm. A pure vessel into which the Dharma the elixir of life, the truth, can be poured. He says, if you're free of the concepts of me and mine, this happens at the Hinayana stage, begin to, you can develop discriminating awareness. Soso rangrik. Rangrik means, soso means individual. Rangrik means it's self-aware. It's like this space that we come back to in our meditation. It's aware of itself. We don't have to be aware of it. We come back to this awareness. It's here. It permeates everything. Individually seeing things as they are, as separate entities. It allows you to experience the teachings through the five senses, and your meditation practice allows you to experience the soothing quality of the Dharma, not as a euphoric state, but as an organic gentleness. This is so important. It's an organic gentleness. An understanding of wisdom arises out of all that. It may be very faint, but it is still quite deep. And what this wisdom means, you see, is not knowing something, knowledge. Wisdom is being knowledge. This space, being one with it, and everything that arises and passes in it. That's wisdom. Wisdom is non-dual. It's not knowing that I know that. It's a state of being in knowingness. And wisdom arises out of all that. The second kind of student is an upside-down container. You can't pour the Dharma into it. It's a person who is completely turned off to the Dharma, or is completely preoccupied with other things like love, money, work, whatever. And so they just can't hear it. They're preoccupied. They're an upside-down cup. The third type is a leaky container. It has a hole in the bottom, and so it can't retain the teachings. He says, you are naive and willing to listen, but you're not willing to memorize what you have heard and to regard it as your own practice. What you have heard is completely lost. It just makes a mess on the carpet. And then the fourth kind, a poisonous container. It's unclean or poisonous and taints anything put into it. The poison is your own personal egotism. You would like the Dharma to reinforce your own point of view, agenda. I remember a student early on, not that early on, he'd been around for a while. He was utterly ingenuine to me and Rinpoche and everybody. And he was always taking the teachings and sort of twisting them a little bit for his own benefit. Eventually, Rinpoche threw him out, told him he was expelled from the Sangha. We were all shocked that he would do such a thing. And then he told us that it was the only way he could get through to this individual. The only way, because that person was taking everything that he said and twisting it to serve his own ego. But he couldn't twist complete rejection. Eventually, that person came back and succeeded in staying and being a student. But he was gone for some years. And we were all sort of shocked at how violent that was. Then he says these last three, though, are not to be regarded as bad students exactly, and he let this guy come back. They could be regarded as somewhat sweet, but not quite capable of hearing the Dharma at all or properly, but not bad. Even that guy that he threw out, guy wanted the Dharma, he was here. He just couldn't stop twisting it into his own ego purposes. He says we're appreciative that they, the three bad types of cup container, we're appreciative that they showed up at all, but they need correction and improvement. They can change from day to day. We all have a little bit of this in us from time to time, more or less, each according to our natures. And it's painful because the teacher points it out in one way or the other. And it can be very painful to be one of these wrong cups. He says, you should be a pure vessel to receive the teachings. Instead of being closed off, you could cultivate complete openness. That's the upside down container. You could cultivate being open, an turned up container. Instead of being a leaky container, you could learn to memorize and be able to comprehend the teachings and retain them. Instead of being a poisonous vessel, you could free your mind from the kleshas. These are the passions, the egotistical concerns that destroy us. You should listen, receive, and understand as much as you can from the spiritual friend and their teachings as naturally and directly as possible. Learning the Mahayana, its theory, its techniques, how to practice, what the stages of the Mahayana path are. There are the 10 bhumis. There are the 5 paths. We're going to be studying that. We've already studied the 5 paths a bit, but we're going to be studying the 10 bhumis too, 10 stages of the Bodhisattva path, and everything else about the Mahayana. You should discuss with your spiritual friend. Communication is everything. And compare your understanding experience with what the spiritual friend says. Again, I'll just tell you that the essence of a teacher, according to Trungpa Rinpoche, especially at the Mahayana and especially at the Vajrayana stage of the path, is one with whom you have open friendship and communication. It's essential. Only at the Hinayana stage of the path is the teacher just a source of information and an example. And then here, these are some quotes that I've just really thought were essential. He says, working with a teacher is an absolutely necessary prerequisite for journeying on the Bodhisattva path. Once you have discovered your enlightened gene, you begin to discover your Buddha nature, your awakened state of mind that is in you. You need something to cause it to grow, and that cause is the spiritual friend. So working with the spiritual friend is like sowing a seed and pouring water over it. In that way, the seed will sprout, begin to develop young green shoots and blossom. Then you can be quite certain that what you have done is right, that it is the best possibility. You begin your path by developing a personal practice. That way you're not jumping the gun, so to speak, trying to get ahead of yourself, so that you begin to know what you're getting into. This is produced by the basic Hinayana training. In working with a spiritual friend, personal training is absolutely important. So we could have a discussion. Hi.
Shinji?
Are you calling on someone, Barry?
Yeah, Shinji.
Yeah, me.
Shinji?
Yes. I don't know if it's appropriate, but can you maybe give an example of like your experience of the spiritual friend bringing trouble or difficulty to you? Because I've heard Rinpoche said this like a long time ago, but I always kind of find it a little bit difficult to relate with that. Like, what does it mean?
What? Say that again. He said
Spiritual
what?
friend bringing trouble to you, or like making things difficult to you, which is different from the spiritual guide, like in the Hinayana. So he always said that like in Mahayana, it's like very heavy-handed, and like the spiritual friend like brings up problem to the surface to you and make things difficult. So I wonder if you can maybe give an example of how you experienced that with Trungpa Rinpoche.
Oh, you.
Is it okay?
Um, I'll just suffice it to say, I certainly did. But he also told me something which is difficult for me, not to be confessional. And this stuff is very, very personal. Each one of us, it can go incredibly deep. And with someone like Trungpa Rinpoche, especially, it can go incredibly deep because he sees so deeply into you. And because he was so uncompromising. For a little while, he might compromise, but eventually, if you were on some sort of ego trip, you'd run up against a brick wall.
Must
So
be terrifying, I
it's
think.
yes, it could be. Depends completely on you, each one of us, to the extent to which we realize what's going on and begin to let go of our neuroticism, and the extent to which we hold on to it, and the extent to which we open and involve ourselves with a spiritual friend, that can get painful.
Can you maybe also talk a little bit about the difference between being open and being confessional? Because I feel that like if someone has like pretty low self-esteem or is confused, like it's pretty easy to go like from being like confused the idea of what's being open to self-condemn or like have self-doubt and become confessional, if that makes sense.
You've seen people, you know people who present a facade of what they think will impress you, seduce you, make you like them. And you know that person. I'm talking about something extreme, but we've all experienced this in individuals who we know are just being ingenuine with us. They want us to see them in a particular way and respond to them and interact with them in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not appreciating who we are. And they're not being open and truly who they are. There's a falseness to it. And you can see in those people that when they speak, they've got an agenda. You can see it behind their eyes. You distrust it. You can almost, if you're really attentive, you can read what that person's agenda is sometimes. It's a kind of dishonesty. It's a manipulativeness. It's a facade that one covers oneself. It's a mask. A bodhisattva wears no masks. None at all. And that doesn't mean that they're walking around being confessional. That is another agenda. What are you going to get from it? They're just being open, genuine, who they are. And they're being of benefit, help to the world around them for no reason, just out of complete inspiration, complete heart, compassion, genuineness.
Okay, that satisfies my curiosity, I would say. Thank you.
Could I say something that
Please,
for
Laura.
me,
Yeah.
the difference for me between open and confessional, I can be open with my present experience with you, And confessional feels more like I'm really into the story, the narrative. Does that feel different?
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. I think confessional can have an agenda, a purposefulness. Why is the person confessing? What do they want to get? There's an egotism involved. Could be anything. A person could confess because they think that then you'll like them. You know, whatever it might be. You'll admire their openness. I'm just making it up. All kinds of reasons. What do you think?
I think, yeah, I think it can be like to gain like to like, yeah, it's not like, it's still having an agenda. It's still like trying to because like being open is more like conveying how you feel and your genuine feeling, but being confessional is more like making up a story, like Laura said, and saying that. But it's,
I think that
there's a difference. I'm not putting it very well. I think I get that.
I think that when you come across a person who's not being open, what they're doing is that they're trying to boost their own ego in whatever way that they particularly like. They want to be a big deal in some particular style that they've learned. And it's having to do with them and their particular big dealness.
I think also with confessional, there's like a feeling that after you say like everything's gonna be okay and you're gonna be forgiven, I think there's also like some way of like why to be confessional.
Yeah. Kim,
Okay.
Randy, you had your hand raised.
Hi, it was me. This wasn't my question, but it occurred to me that there's some element of entertainment when one is being confessional. Whether you're entertaining yourself or the ego is entertaining itself, or you're doing it to entertain the other person. But there's even if it's a horror, there's still a quality of entertainment. But my question was, what does he say, if anything, and in terms of offering advice about how to know whether or not the trust that you're placing in your spiritual friend is well-founded? How does one make that choice, given that you said that he's advising us that it could be very difficult and painful and confrontational and in your business? And so how does one really ever know whether or not that trust is well-founded?
There's always a danger. That's part of the challenge of relating to a spiritual friend with openness. But you begin to realize that the spiritual friend has your interests at heart, if they're genuine, if they're the real thing, and that they really are a friend, helping you to overcome your neurosis, one's neuroticism, rather than manipulating you for some of their personal ends.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to definitely use your intelligence in evaluating a spiritual friend. Definitely. But it's also, it's a bit like a love relationship, you know? In fact, there's a lot of love in the relationship with a spiritual friend. And that when you open to someone whom you love, there's always risk because you're opening your heart. Same thing with a spiritual friend. I mean, the essence of that relationship is open-heartedness. and genuineness and love, but there may be pain in it too, to the extent to which you hold on to your ego, because the spiritual friend ultimately won't let you do that. That's not their job. Their job is the reverse, to help you overcome your ego. And that can be very painful.
Can I just say?
Are we?
Can I just say
We've got all these people with their hands raised.
I'd just like to add one little thing about that, which is spiritual friend is not something where you see someone on a list and decide, okay, there's a spiritual friend, and you open the doors. It's a relationship that you develop.
This is true. Well, let's just, in no particular order, Ed.
Thank you. You touched on it a couple times tonight, I think, and I was wondering if you could develop the relationship between being genuine and understanding non-duality.
Being genuine starts much earlier than understanding non-duality. Being genuine has to do with being open in your communication with your spiritual friend and not wearing a mask. Being truly who you are, showing your faults, your egotism too. Exposing that, being willing to show that, which could be painful.
How does that lead to non-duality, or is there some ultimate progress or development of a diminishment of your own ego into a crumbling of the distinction between self and other? What did you call it? You called it twofold egolessness.
Your ego wants things to be in a certain way. It's got a story about what it wants in the world and in your life. It's a very selfish story. It's about me. And the spiritual friend, their job is to confound that egotism in one way or another, depending on you and the circumstances. And when they confound that egotism, it can be very painful because you are so committed to it. We come into this path so committed, varying each one of us in varying degrees, so committed to me, to I. And really, what the spiritual friend is doing is putting up roadblocks to that, one way or another, creating situations with your help that are going to confound your desires, your selfish, ego-centered desires. And in doing that, they give you the opportunity to open to being a completely ordinary person, a citizen of this planet, this world.
Thank you.
I think that all of us who were students of Trungpa Rinpoche in varying degrees went through some kind of stripping away in varying degrees. How about Alejandro? You've had your hand up for a while.
Thank you, John. I love your description of the connection between Maitri, Karuna, and Mudita. And I believe my question is, the way you presented them, they seem to be very cyclical and very connected. So it seemed that from genuine loving kindness, compassion would be the natural result. And from authentic compassion, joy seems to be the natural effect. But when I see them in this way, I also see that mudita, or joy, seems to naturally lead back to loving kindness. I see them very, very connected in this way. And I was wondering if you can talk about ways to enter them, perhaps individually. I want to say they almost feel like a catch-22, where you already have to be in the cycle in order to keep all three going. And in this moment, I'm really struggling with joy so much in my personal life. Loving kindness for me seems to manifest when I think of the 6 paramitas a lot. And so for me, meditation and exertion really lead me to touch, at least on the surface, loving kindness. And compassion seems to come out of, diligence and effort. But I was having a conversation with a friend recently because I lost a family member recently in a tragic accident, and I was sharing how depressed and how much I've been struggling with that. And my friend told me, well, what about the Dharma? Like, isn't that enough to bring joy into your life? And it almost made me feel guilty that I'm not feeling any joy in my life because of this situation. So I was wondering if you can talk a bit more about mudita and about ways of reaching the depth of that joy.
That joy is not incompatible with sorrow over the death of someone you loved. The two go together. But what really counts, you see, let's go back to Maitri, that you begin to discover that you don't have to change yourself. And that in that discovery, you begin to touch on and discover enormous freedom. Freedom from self-criticism, freedom from self-aggrandizement, freedom from self-improvement. Enormous freedom that you could actually be free to be who and what you are in the moment. And that is where Maitri begins. Or maybe it's where it develops. That kind of loving kindness for oneself has an enormous discovery of freedom in it, which is so, what's the word? Kind to oneself. That you could be free from self-improvement, from self-criticism. And in that freedom, then that begins to lead towards, for one thing, you begin to see how other people are chained in the same way, and they could be free too. And that whole thing of that freedom from this terrible suffering that we impose on ourselves brings joy, enormous joy. But one has to really begin to understand it. I was remembering today, I was thinking about a book that I read years ago, which many of you have probably read, Carlos Castaneda's book about Don Juan, the Yaqui Indian, the sorcerer. And in one of those books, Castaneda describes how Don Juan is with his buddy, Don Gennaro, and they're both brujos. They're both, Yaqui Indian sorcerers in Mexico. And the two of them, and Castaneda is listening to their conversation, and the two of them are kind of snickering behind their hands about how he's such an intellectual, Castaneda. And he just asks questions all the time. And he's overhearing this conversation. So finally he says to Don Juan, he interrupts him and he says, "Should I stop asking questions?" And Don Juan says to him, "Oh no, don't do that. Then you'd be trying to improve yourself. It's the worst vice men have." I've never forgotten that line. Well, that's the beginning of Maitri, is giving up constantly trying to be critical of ourselves and improve ourselves. And instead, we see it, we welcome it, we take it to our hearts. And out of that, all the rest of it flows. That's why sitting meditation is such an opportunity to develop Maitri for ourselves.
Joy being described here as more connected to freedom rather than a sense of happiness or joy or like an exalted state.
Both. I think both, yeah. All of it. Yeah, you could actually, God, you could be free. I mean, amazing. What joy that would bring.
That's beautiful, John. Thank you very much.
Let's see, who else has their hands up? Robert Sulecki and then Barbara. I see hands up.
I guess mine was about the spiritual friend. You had talked about, I just made a note here a second. Personal training with the spiritual friend. And I was curious what type of personal training we can undergo to work with the spiritual friend. I've had my challenges with it. And it's been intoxicatingly helpful at times where people seem to, the more open and clear my communication is and more honest and genuine it is, the better things tend to get. Yet I kind of feel like that's not a perfect answer either, because that leads to ego at a certain point, but it's a harder ego to conquer because it's less different. It's not as easy to see. So I guess my question is, what type of training can we undergo early on to work with the spiritual friends better?
Practicing the Hinayana path, shamatha vipassana, studying the teachings, all of that, and developing a relationship with the spiritual friend that's communicative, open, has some intimacy to some degree. I mean, nobody's forcing it, but yeah. All of that. It comes as a natural development on the path. You're attracted to the teacher, one way or the other, either out of friendship or out of desire to get something, or both, or some combination, or who knows what. And the relationship begins to develop of openness, friendship, communication, the teachings. But sooner or later, with the spiritual friend, they'll see your habitual patterns, which may be weak, may be strong. Each one of us is different. And they will help us to become free of those habitual patterns. Those habitual patterns are beliefs. Freud, called them defense mechanisms. They are beliefs in how it has to be, how we have to be, how the world has to be. And they are very rigid in enacting those habitual patterns to the extent that we do. Each one of us is different. We do a violence to ourselves and to the world, wanting our lives to be according to some dream that we have concocted, that somehow we've inherited. And it's a distortion. It has nothing to do with appreciating life as it arises in this present moment now, alive, full of juice. It has to do with some idea of the way in which we, or the world, or the way people around us need to be for me and my ego, for me and my happiness.
Wow.
And that's what has to be identified. And sometimes we can't even see it. But the spiritual friend, ideally, can.
Yeah. That's where I'm running into the most conflict and the most trouble, because we all have our ideas of what would make the world better, and it's hard to let go of those things. And now I have some light and some thought to proceed forward with.
I guess the telltale is that it's always somehow, in the last analysis, those habitual patterns, they are about I, about me and my agenda, me and my happiness,
Yeah.
me and my fears
Mhm.
that I want to overcome. And we've been taught these. Each one of us has our own style of it.
Yeah. Not easy thing to get past.
That's what this path is all about. And it is. I mean, it's what else is there worth doing?
Yeah. It's much better. Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Barbara. You had a hand raised.
Okay, there we go. I have a spiritual friend, yes, and he's very good. So good that it gets very difficult in having your ego exposed all the time, particularly if you have a really strong ego. And I have found out that I do. And it's really painful and sometimes hard to accept. But apart from that, I somehow can't, I'm finding trouble understanding how if you stop criticizing yourself and finding fault, and in other words, recognizing the kleshas when you're in them. I mean, don't you have to do that to expose your ego? Now, I understand that my tree is kindness. And of course, I suppose the idea is to do it in a kind way. So maybe I've answered my own question here, but still exposing ego and seeing through your kleshas, and isn't that criticizing yourself?
No. The best, you froze, I think. Can you hear me? Hello? Barbara, I'm not sure you're hearing. The best way, the only way really, to expose ego is by acting appropriately in the situation, whatever that situation is, and they will come up. Those situations where you are given the opportunity to act neurotically, to act selfishly, self-aggrandizingly. And to the extent that we can see that's a tendency in us, and let it go and act appropriately, that's the path. Now, if we can't see it, if we think, we're self-justifying and we justify our continued neurotic behavior, we're going to get ourselves into trouble one way or another, sooner or later, especially with a spiritual friend.
By defending your
egotism,
opinion, or
because
instead of
stand
revealing.
Right.
What's that again?
The spiritual friend will not stand for it. They won't go along with it. They may for a little while
See through it.
Chance, but eventually they're going to.
So my internet. I see. Well, okay.
That's what he's talking about here.
Yeah, it's sorry, I think my internet is cutting out.
It is a little bit.
So it is, yeah. I'm not catching everything you say. So, yeah. Well, it sounds, I mean, it is simple, but far from easy, very far from easy.
Sooner or later, your egotism is going to become present in the relationship with the spiritual friend. And they will make it obvious.
Yes.
And you have the opportunity to go beyond it. Or if you cling to it, it can be very painful.
Very, yeah. It's, yeah. It's so,
Oops, we're losing.
yeah, the whole idea,
Yeah.
catch yourself. But that's criticizing and finding fault.
It is.
So that's the dilemma I have. Mhm. But I suppose you just have to recognize that that's kindness.
No, it's just, you'll see, that the situation develops between a conflict between your egotism and what needs to actually happen in sanity and kindness and compassion for yourself and everybody else. So
Right.
giving up the egotism is not hard. Well, it can be, depending on each of us.
I find it really hard. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna make a note to myself.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
So Danielle,
Hi. This kind of maybe sounds silly, but like, where do you find a spiritual friend, or who, like, where are you supposed to find one, Do you know what I'm saying?
yes.
Like, if you're not around people who are Buddhists practicing
You have to look.
and online nowadays. So,
Online, right? So much harder, isn't it? And I remember Khandro Rinpoche giving a talk years ago at the Shambhala Center, and somebody asked her basically that question that you just asked. And she said, you may not find that person in this lifetime. There are no guarantees. It's up to you. It's the meeting. It's like you meet your spouse, right? It's kind of a magic. Other people weren't attracted to that spouse, but you were, to each other. Same thing happens with a spiritual friend. I'm not saying it's a romantic relationship, but there's that kind of the magic of the meeting. And open communication and friendship.
and if not, then the Sangha can be partly your spiritual friends.
Partly, yeah, but not nearly as much as an individual. Meg.
Yeah, this is just anecdotal, and maybe someone can verify if it's true, but I read somewhere that Ram Dass, with his guru, and I don't know what the difference is between a guru and a teacher, if there is one, but Ram Dass's guru told him that he should give away all his money, and apparently Ram Dass came from a really wealthy family and had a trust fund, and so he gave away all his money because he just did everything his guru told him. And to me, that was like, wow, how could anyone have that kind of faith? And I, and then from there, he, in his older years, he needed a lot of care because of his illness, and he needed, I think, permanent or someone there all the time. So I don't know, just thought I'd share that. To me, I think for myself, I would have a lot of problems just trusting someone so intimately with my life.
Yeah, definitely. That's a big part of it. Big part of it. And the relationship only becomes more intimate in the Vajrayana. Although, frankly, this description of the spiritual friend really smacks of the Vajrayana teaching. I mean, Trungpa Rinpoche was always coming from the point of view of the Vajrayana. So even in describing this, it sounds to me, yeah. I remember I knew I had a spiritual friend who wasn't, in addition to Trungpa Rinpoche, I was friends with a man named Kobun Chino Sensei. He was a Zen priest. Eventually he became a Roshi. And the relationship was very sweet and gentle compared to the relationship I had with Trungpa Rinpoche, which was a little bit more demanding. Kobun Chino is just a very sweet, wonderful guy. And there are people around who remember him, and he died young. Terrible accident.
Can I say something here, John? Just
yeah.
I think this is worth saying that it was brought up, a little while ago. Like, how do you trust someone as a spiritual friend? And that's a very real concern. And the danger is if you cultivate some sort of a fantasy of what a relationship is going to be like, or what a spiritual friend is going to be like, and you pursue that or are seduced into that, that it has to be a very genuine communication, a certain kind of honesty that goes both ways.
Absolutely.
And I know that Ram Dass, for instance, started being devoted to this woman who was out on Long Island somewhere, who had visions, and he became convinced that she was channeling his departed guru and started following her, and she started making demands on him that he needed to do this and that. And then finally, at some point, he kind of woke up and realized that it wasn't real, that he was being duped, so it can happen. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Sarah. And then I think we don't have any more. This probably might be the last. I don't see any other hands up.
Thank you. I was curious, is it possible for us to uncover our own habitual tendencies, or should we try to leave that to our spiritual friend?
I think it's possible that you can do some of that, but ultimately, almost by definition, you can't get at the core of it. There's too much I going on.
Should I give up trying so hard to uncover them then?
No,
Okay.
no, it's up to you. It's up to you. But I mean, he says quite categorically, uncategorically, that this can only be done with a spiritual friend. He said that in the chapter. And in my experience, that's true. There are very few self-enlightened Buddhists.
Thank you.
Well, friends, I think we should end. Let's see. Who would like, Meg was doing the chanting. So we're going to have a discussion group tomorrow. You're all welcome to come. And Meg, would you lead us in the closing chant? I'll put it up on the screen.
We will close by dedicating the merit earned by our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
If your doctor asks,
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good
Thank
night,
you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks,
everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Yeah.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John.
Hey, John, what do you think about starting to introduce the Heart Sutra as a chant? After all, this is the Mahayana, of course.
We could. I think we but
Not the
rather get to
morning.
rather wait till we get to Shunyata.
Okay, I was
Discussion
thinking not for the morning, but for before class,
Oh,
because it is the Mahayana.
let's talk about it some more, because I think that when we get to the subject of emptiness, Shunyata, then the Heart Sutra will be more understandable.
Yeah, I love it because it packs a wallop. Boy, it's
It's true. It does.
hello, folks.
Okay. John?
Yes, Robert?
Is it possible I could get a copy of today's reading so that I could read it? Because I found it very helpful.
Yeah. And ultimately, if you're going to continue with the course, you might buy the book.
Okay.
But I can send you, I think, a PDF.
Okay, great. What's the name of the book so that I know to look for it?
It's called The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma, Volume 2. And it's subtitled The Bodhisattva Path of Wisdom and Compassion by Chögyam Trungpa.
Perfect. I will look for it right away. Thank you.
Good. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wonderful, Robert. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it seems like it. It was a beautiful passage.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The book I shared with you, good evening, John. The book I shared with you, Infinite Circle,